I'm excited to present to you this paper that I wrote with Greg Distelhorst called High Road versus Low Road Employment Practices. This is based on a paper that we published in 2022 in Organization Science. And the basic topic of this research is socially irresponsible employment practices. So here's a list of what these consist of. Paying below the minimum wage and failure to pay overtime and mandatory off-the-clock work. When you require your workers to come in and get set up, but you don't pay them for that. Failure to pay into mandatory social insurance programs. Exceeding the legal limits on hours of work per day or per week or per month, requiring someone to stay longer than is legally admissible. Deceiving people into taking jobs that are not what was advertised. Hiring people who are underage, not giving people rest, failure to sign contracts that are required, and then unethical discipline, violence, threats of violence, or threats associated with trying to get workers to do what you want. So these are the practices that we're looking at. And the setting for much of this work is in relatively low-income countries in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, including, for example, Bangladesh. This is a picture of the Rana Plaza disaster in 2013 in Bangladesh. In this building, which collapsed in April of 2013, there were garment workers that were producing, clothing for fast fashion. And there's reports that managers required workers to go back into this building to do work after knowing or hearing a report that a collapse may have been imminent or that the building was structurally unsound. There were managers that threatened to withhold people's pay if they refused to go into the building. There was pressure in the building that seemed to have emanated, at least in part, from the requirements of the buyers to finish these orders on time. And the production deadlines were so strong and so intense that the managers required that workers stay in the building, even though they knew that it was unsound to be there. So those are the kinds of practices that we're interested in. The buyers of many of the products that are produced in these factories are all over the world and are some of the most familiar names that may strike you from this list. Includes manufacturers of electronics products like computers and smartphones, as well as buyers of garments and luggage and books and other products that are easily outsourced to low-income countries or even mid-income countries, maybe even high-income countries, but where these factories exist that are specialists in taking these kinds of orders. The system that we're studying is represented here on this slide. On the right-hand side, we have multinational companies. They place orders with importers with specifications for what they're ordering. The importer then goes to a sourcing agent that has relationships with factories in various countries. They could be anywhere in the world, often in Southeast Asia, but could be in Turkey, could be anywhere in the world, in Africa. And these sourcing agents, take the specs and place the orders with those factories. The sourcing agent is required and does conduct audits of the factories. And we were able to, through much of my co-author, Greg Distelhorst's effort, what he did was he struck a relationship with the sourcing agent and was able to get information from these factory audits. And what they show, looking at 4,400 plus factories, over 6,200 factory year observations, what they show is that there is a pretty prevalent, almost 50% incidence of people having to work overtime hours that's not properly compensated. Having too few days of rest is also pretty common. Not paying social insurance programs is common. Overtime wages are too low or not paid at all. That is something like, 38% or 35% or so of factories have that practice, and in the audits are identified in the audits. Base wages are too low. And then you can see employment contracts, underage labor, and unethical discipline is also unacceptably prevalent. 70% or so of the factories are demonstrating at least one irresponsible practice. So that is what we're studying here. Now, there's a number of different things going on that, can partially at least explain why these practices persist. The first is that there's a failure institutionally. There aren't enough labor regulators or inspectors. The unions and the associations aren't strong enough to combat these practices, and there isn't enough media coverage of them. So there's institutional problems on one hand. There's also ineffective pressure from external stakeholders. So we know the importers are putting pressures on these companies to deliver very low cost stuff as fast as possible. And those pressures are not entirely consistent with pressures that also may emanate from importers to engage in socially responsible practices. And that's what Greg and I are going to report on in this project. We also know that sometimes there are private labor auditors, that consumers may demand that the cessation of these practices, but in an ineffective enforcement environment, the pressures don't materialize in action here. In this study, what we're going to look at is pressures that are directly emanating from the employers themselves and their strategies. Some companies in these settings really are so committed to having the cheapest possible product at the lowest possible cost to win orders through that mechanism, that they engage in these behaviors as a way to sustain their profitability. And we also are going to be studying factories where internal stakeholders, including especially workers, have specialized skills, and that actually does allow them to pressure their employers to adopt strategies that are more aligned with differentiation of their goods. And these differentiation strategies we're going to find are associated with remediating the socially irresponsible practices. So that's just an overview. We're going to be focusing in particular on the factories that are audited and looking at the relationship between these practices, these unacceptable practices, and the kinds of product quality that they deliver. So here's our logic. You've got a situation where there's weak enforcement of labor laws. Employers are, going to be more often socially irresponsible where there's weak enforcement in the first place. Even in that context, though, there may be situations where working conditions are relevant. So if there's poor working conditions that are financially damaging to these employers, they may stop those socially irresponsible employment practices. What happens in these contexts is that if a worker has more bargaining power because they're able to do something no one else can do, they have specialized skills, then those specialized skills deliver differentiated offerings. So more high-end luggage, more specialized clothing, more differentiated computer chips, then those workers with those specialized skills are valued more by the factories. And so those factories don't engage in these irresponsible employment practices as much. That's our logic. The factories that, on the other hand, are going for cheap output that doesn't have any differentiation and doesn't require the involvement of workers with specialized skills, then those workers have no bargaining power. So our prediction is here that factories, they rely on systems of socially irresponsible practices. So we see lots of factories that engage in more than one of these. They're very highly correlated. And that system of irresponsible employment, practices is involved with a system of generating lower quality goods and lower revenue per employee out of a factory. So if you're pushing to try to meet price and cost pressure in a factory, you're going to press on wages and, be more likely to engage in these practices. Just to give you a feel for the types of orders that are being placed here and the quality of the stuff that's being generated, out of the 4,400 factories that we study, 92% of the audits showed product quality pass rate, 92%. It's pretty low compared to other countries, other types of factories. The orders delivered on schedule was just 71%. So, lots of pressure to deliver faster. The order value coming into these factories is only $2,800. So, these are relatively small orders, and the order value per employee per year is about $10,000, $11,000. So, this is really, low end stuff that's being ordered here. What we learn is that these socially irresponsible practices are really highly correlated. If you engage in wage theft, you're more likely to require unpaid overtime and not pay social insurance and not give your workers any days of rest and hire underage workers and engage in violence and inappropriate discipline. So those things are very correlated, suggest that this is a systemic kind of thing going on, which is, of course, going to bleed into the kinds of output that is generated by these factories. So, the factories that engage in these irresponsible practices listed on the left here are associated with lower quality output from the factory sent back through the sourcing agent to the importer into these multinational corporations. They are less likely to pass the quality inspections. They are less likely to be on time in delivery. The orders are smaller, and the order value per employee is smaller. So all of this cost pressure, when a manufacturer places an order for what it perceives as commodity stuff that can be made by low-skilled workers in these countries, that's part of a system of socially irresponsible employment practices that is pervasive. So, summary, we're seeing, institutional and external stakeholder perspectives as relevant with low enforcement. These irresponsible employment practices occur in these factories that generate this low-cost output. That from the perspective of the workers, that these socially irresponsible practices, especially things like wage theft and pressing people like in the Rana Plaza disaster to work when it's too dangerous to work, that kind of pressure, it boosts the performance of these factories that rely on low-skilled workers and are competing for these, super intensive delivery schedules and these opportunities to sell goods internationally to multinational companies at the lowest possible cost. That these employment practices associated with lower product quality, service quality, and measures of labor productivity, those are low-cost strategies even in this environment, and that differentiated output, companies that place orders for more specialized inputs from these countries, more specialized stuff, higher quality stuff, they're creating the conditions for a transition to less damaging employment practices. So if you want to get on the high road as a multinational corporation, it's not just enough to say that you're going to do audits and that you want your suppliers to be conforming. You also have to pay them more for more highly differentiated materials being sent into your company here. Thank you so much for your kind attention, and now over to Martin Reeves.